Young boy, barely dressed for the snow, hides behind a bench on a freezing Boston night. When a detective finds him, the child's first words reveal a chilling mystery that leads to a secret room, a missing sister, and a mother who risked everything to save them. But the danger is far from over. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The December wind cut through the streets of Boston like a blade, sending swirls of fresh snow dancing across the cobblestones of Beacon Hill. It was 1898, and the city wore its winter coat with Victorian elegance. Gas lamps flickered against the early evening darkness, their warm glow reflecting off the frosted windows of brownstone mansions that lined the steep, narrow streets. The common stretched out like a white canvas, its trees bare and skeletal against the pewter sky. Detective James Thornton pulled his woolen overcoat tighter as he walked past the public garden, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 32 years of age, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead beneath his fedora, and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. His strong jaw was set with determination, though tonight those eyes held a weariness that came from too many cases and too little rest. He had been called to investigate a peculiar matter. A woman had visited the police station that morning, frantic and barely coherent, speaking of danger and secrets before collapsing. She had been taken to Massachusetts General Hospital, but before losing consciousness, she had whispered an address on Mount Vernon Street and begged that someone check on her son. The desk sergeant had dismissed it as the ravings of an ill woman, but something in the report had caught James's attention. Perhaps it was the mention of the Ashworth name, a family he vaguely recalled from society pages, or perhaps it was simply his instinct that told him something was terribly wrong. The address led him to a grand townhouse with black shutters and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The windows were dark and no smoke rose from the chimneys despite the bitter cold. James approached the front steps cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver concealed beneath his coat. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the quiet street, but received no answer. He tried the door and found it unlocked. Never a good sign. Inside, the house was cold and silent, decorated with the heavy furniture and ornate wallpaper typical of wealthy Boston homes. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of light from his lantern as he moved through the parlor and dining room, finding nothing amiss except for the unnatural stillness. The servants appeared to have abandoned their posts, and there was no sign of the household's occupants. It was as he stepped into the garden at the rear of the property that he saw the bench, a wrought iron seat nearly buried in snow beneath a bare oak tree. And there, barely visible in the gathering darkness, was a small form huddled behind it. James's heart quickened as he approached, his footsteps crunching in the fresh powder. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old, his small frame wrapped in a thin jacket wholly inadequate for the weather. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue, but his eyes, bright and intelligent, watched James with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Snow had gathered in his dark hair and on his trembling shoulders. "Will you keep us safe, like Mom said?" The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute trust, as if this stranger represented his last chance at salvation. James immediately removed his overcoat and wrapped it around the shivering child, then lifted him in his strong arms. The boy was light, too light, and cold as ice. "I'm Detective Thornton, son. I'm going to help you. What's your name?" "Thomas," the boy managed through chattering teeth. "Thomas Ashworth. And my sister, she's inside, in the hidden room. She's only 4. Mom said to stay hidden until someone came. She said a detective would come." James's mind raced as he carried the boy toward the house. "Where is your mother now, Thomas?" "She left this morning. She was scared. Said bad men were coming and she had to lead them away from us." Tears began to stream down the child's frozen cheeks. "She promised someone good would find us. She said to tell them about Father's papers." Inside the house, Thomas directed James to the library on the second floor. Behind a false panel in the bookshelf, cleverly disguised and easily missed, was a small room no larger than a closet. There, curled up on a pile of blankets with a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, was a little girl with golden curls and eyes wide with fear. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice tremulous. "It's all right, Margaret," Thomas said with the brave determination of an older brother. "This is the detective Mom told us about. We're safe now." James carefully extracted the girl from the hiding place, noting how she clung to her brother with desperate strength. Both children were severely cold, hungry, and exhausted. His first priority was getting them warm and fed. His second would be unraveling whatever mystery had driven their mother to such desperate measures. He took them to his modest apartment on Charles Street, where his landlady, Mrs. O'Brien, a kindly widow with 6 grown children of her own, immediately took charge. She bundled the children in warm blankets, prepared hot soup, and clucked over them like a mother hen, while James sent word to the hospital about the children's whereabouts. As the children ate ravenously, James studied them. Thomas had the serious demeanor of a boy forced to grow up too quickly, while Margaret, despite her ordeal, had a sweetness about her that tugged at his heart. What kind of danger could threaten such innocent souls? "Thomas," James said gently, pulling up a chair beside the boy, "can you tell me about these papers your mother mentioned?" The boy's expression grew solemn. "Father died 6 months ago. Everyone said it was his heart, but Mother didn't believe it. She said he was frightened in the days before he died. He worked for Vandermeer Shipping Company. He was their chief accountant. Mother found papers in his study after he passed, hidden in a book. She wouldn't tell me what they said, but she became frightened too. Then strange men started watching our house. That's when she sent the servants away and told us we might need to hide." James felt the familiar tingle of a case unfolding, but this one was different. It involved children, innocents who needed protection. He would need help, resources beyond what his position as a detective could easily provide. He would also need somewhere safer to keep the children while he investigated. The next morning brought news from the hospital that chilled him to the bone. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth had died during the night, her body showing signs of poisoning. The doctor suspected arsenic, administered slowly over time. She had fought to stay alive long enough to ensure help reached her children, and she had succeeded, but at the cost of her own life. James stood in the hospital corridor, his jaw clenched with anger and determination. Someone had murdered both parents and intended to silence whatever secrets John Ashworth had discovered. Now 2 orphaned children were the only remaining loose ends, and he had no doubt that whoever was behind this would eventually come looking for them. He needed an ally, someone with resources and connections that could help him protect Thomas and Margaret while he investigated. His mind turned to the one person in Boston who might be both willing and able to assist, Miss Cordelia Winters. He had met her briefly the previous year during an investigation into art theft from the Museum of Fine Arts. She was 26, the daughter of the late industrialist Harrison Winters, and had inherited not only her father's considerable fortune, but also his sharp mind and sense of justice. She was beautiful, that much was undeniable. With chestnut hair she wore in an elegant Gibson girl style, warm hazel eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and a graceful bearing that commanded respect in Boston's highest social circles. But it was her character that had impressed James most, her genuine concern for others and her willingness to use her privilege to help those less fortunate. She had established a home for orphaned children in the South End, funded entirely by her personal fortune, and she sat on the boards of several charitable organizations. If anyone could provide temporary sanctuary for Thomas and Margaret while keeping them hidden from dangerous eyes, it was Cordelia Winters. James found himself standing before the Winters mansion on Commonwealth Avenue that afternoon, a stately edifice of limestone and brick that spoke of old money and refined taste. The butler who answered his knock regarded him with the polite skepticism reserved for unexpected visitors. But when James presented his card and explained the urgent nature of his visit, he was shown into a drawing room decorated in shades of cream and gold. Cordelia entered moments later, and James was struck anew by her presence. She wore a day dress of deep burgundy wool, tailored to perfection, with leg-of-mutton sleeves and a high collar trimmed with delicate lace. Her posture was impeccable, but there was nothing cold or distant about her demeanor. When she saw him, her face brightened with recognition. "Detective Thornton," she said, extending her hand. "What an unexpected pleasure. I trust this isn't a social call, given the serious expression you're wearing." He took her hand briefly. Proper etiquette demanded no more, and found himself appreciating the warmth and strength of her grip. "Miss Winters, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I find myself in need of assistance with a matter of utmost urgency and delicacy." She gestured for him to sit and took a seat across from him, her attention focused completely on his words. As he explained the situation, carefully omitting certain details to protect the investigation, He watched her expression shift from concern to determination. These children have lost both parents and are in danger, he concluded. I need a safe place for them to stay, somewhere comfortable and protected, while I investigate. Your orphanage would be ideal, but I fear it may be too public. If the wrong people learn of their whereabouts, they'll stay here, Cordelia interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. This house has more rooms than I could ever use, and my staff is utterly trustworthy. The children will be safe, well cared for, and, most importantly, hidden in plain sight. Who would think to look for fugitive orphans in one of Boston's most prominent households? James felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by admiration for this woman who didn't hesitate to put herself at potential risk for the sake of two children she'd never met. Miss Winters, I cannot thank you enough, but I must warn you, if my suspicions are correct, these children are the only witnesses to a crime that reaches into the highest levels of Boston commerce. Protecting them could be dangerous. Cordelia met his warning with a steady gaze, her hazel eyes unwavering. Detective Thornton, I did not inherit my father's fortune only to hide behind it. If these children need protection, then they shall have it. When can you bring them here? This evening, if that suits you, James replied, finding himself increasingly impressed by her resolve. I'll bring them after dark, to avoid drawing attention. I'll have rooms prepared immediately, Cordelia said, rising gracefully. The East Wing has a nursery that hasn't been used in years. It was mine as a child. It's far from the main entrance and has its own staircase, perfect for keeping curious eyes away. She paused, her expression thoughtful. Detective, you mentioned papers that the children's father had hidden. Do you have them? Not yet. Mrs. Ashworth apparently hid them before she went to the police station. Thomas mentioned they were in a book in his father's study, but I haven't had the opportunity to search the house thoroughly. I plan to return there tonight after I've settled the children here. Cordelia's eyes lit with determination. Then I'll accompany you. I have a better understanding of how books might be organized, and another pair of eyes could prove invaluable. Besides, if anyone questions our presence there together, it would be far more socially acceptable than you being there alone. I could claim to be assessing the property for charitable purposes, taking inventory of items that might be donated to those in need. James hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the practical wisdom of her suggestion. The idea of bringing her into potential danger troubled him, yet he couldn't deny the logic of her reasoning. A woman of her social standing would indeed provide excellent cover for his investigation. Miss Winters, I appreciate your offer, but I must emphasize the risks involved. Duly noted and disregarded, she said with a slight smile that transformed her refined features into something warmer, more approachable. Now, shall we say 8 o'clock this evening? Bring the children at 7, give them time to settle, and then we'll proceed to the Ashworth house together. James found himself agreeing, though a part of him wondered if he was making a mistake involving her so deeply. Yet there was something about Cordelia Winters that inspired confidence, a strength of character that suggested she was far more capable than her privileged upbringing might imply. That evening, Thomas and Margaret were transported to the Winters mansion in James's hired carriage, bundled in warm blankets against the cold. The children's eyes widened as they passed through the iron gates and approached the grand entrance, where Cordelia herself waited to greet them, flanked by her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, a stout woman with kind eyes and a maternal demeanor. "Welcome, Thomas and Margaret," Cordelia said, kneeling gracefully despite her elegant evening dress of midnight blue silk, bringing herself to the children's eye level. "I'm Miss Winters, but you may call me Cordelia. This is going to be your home for a while, and I want you to feel safe here. Are you hungry?" Margaret, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, nodded shyly. Thomas, ever the protective brother, stepped slightly forward. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." "Because everyone deserves kindness, especially children who've been through what you have," Cordelia replied simply. "And because Detective Thornton asked me to, and I trust his judgment. Come, let me show you your rooms, and then we'll have dinner. Mrs. Davies makes the most wonderful hot chocolate you've ever tasted." As Cordelia led the children upstairs, James watched her natural way with them, the gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder, the attentive way she listened to Thomas's cautious questions. There was no condescension in her manner, no performative charity. She genuinely cared, and the children sensed it, gradually relaxing in her presence. An hour later, with the children fed, bathed, and tucked into warm beds in the renovated nursery, Thomas in a room painted pale blue with ship models on the shelves, Margaret in one decorated with soft pink wallpaper and porcelain dolls that had once belonged to Cordelia herself. James and Cordelia prepared to depart for the Ashworth house. Cordelia had changed into a more practical dress of dark gray wool, with a heavy cloak lined with fur against the December cold. She looked every inch the proper Boston lady engaged in charitable work, yet James noticed the determined set of her jaw and the intelligent alertness in her eyes. This was a woman who would not be easily frightened or deterred. The Ashworth house loomed dark and forbidding as their carriage pulled up before it. Snow had fallen again during the evening, covering their previous tracks and lending everything an eerie, muffled quality. James helped Cordelia down from the carriage, his hand lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary on her elbow as she navigated the icy steps. Inside, James lit several oil lamps, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The house felt different at night, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves held secrets. He led Cordelia upstairs to John Ashworth's study, a masculine room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Thomas said the papers were hidden in a book, James said, surveying the hundreds of volumes that surrounded them. His mother found them after his father's death. We're looking for something that might contain financial records or evidence of wrongdoing at Vandermeer Shipping. Cordelia approached the shelves methodically, her fingers trailing along the spines. If I were hiding something important, I'd choose a book that looked innocuous but that I could easily remember. Something with personal significance, perhaps, or... She paused, pulling out a leather-bound volume. Something like this. It was a copy of Moby Dick, worn but well-maintained. Cordelia opened it carefully, and several folded papers fell out, along with a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finds this, if I am dead, please protect my family." James's hands were steady as he unfolded the documents, but his expression grew darker with each page he read. Cordelia stood close beside him, reading over his shoulder, and he was acutely aware of her presence. The faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the warmth of her body in the cold room, the soft sound of her breathing. "My God," she whispered. "This is evidence of massive fraud. Vandermeer Shipping has been falsifying cargo manifests, underreporting values to avoid customs duties, and..." She pointed to a particular ledger page. "Look at these payments to city officials. This implicates half the Harbor Commission, and several prominent businessmen," James added grimly, "including Senator Blackwood's brother. No wonder Ashworth was killed. He knew too much, and they couldn't risk him exposing them." He looked at Cordelia, his expression serious. "This is bigger than I imagined. These men have the power and resources to make anyone disappear. The children are in even more danger than I thought." A sound from downstairs, the creak of a floorboard, made them both freeze. James immediately extinguished the nearest lamp and moved to shield Cordelia with his body, one hand reaching for his revolver. "Did you lock the door behind us?" he whispered. "I thought you did," she breathed back, her voice admirably steady despite the fear he could feel in her slight trembling. Another creak, closer now. Someone was climbing the stairs. James's mind raced. If someone had followed them here, if word had somehow leaked about his investigation, they were trapped. The study had only one exit, and it led directly to the hallway where the intruder was approaching. He guided Cordelia quickly behind the desk, the heaviest piece of furniture that might offer some protection. "Stay down," he commanded softly, then positioned himself between her and the door, his revolver drawn and ready. The footsteps reached the landing and paused. James could hear his own heartbeat, feel Cordelia's hand gripping the back of his coat. Then the door swung open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a lantern. "Detective Thornton?" The voice was young, uncertain. "It's Officer Patrick Riley from the station. Sergeant Morrison sent me to find you. There's been a development." James slowly lowered his weapon, relief flooding through him, even as annoyance prickled at being startled. "Riley, you nearly got yourself shot. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning?" The young officer stepped into the room, his eyes widening as he noticed Cordelia rising gracefully from behind the desk. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, detective, but there's been a break-in at the hospital where Mrs. Ashworth died. Someone tried to steal her personal effects from the morgue. The night watchman interrupted them, and they fled, but..." He hesitated, his expression troubled. The watchman said one of them was wearing a Vandermeer Shipping Company uniform. James exchanged a significant glance with Cordelia. The conspiracy was moving faster than he'd anticipated. They were actively trying to cover their tracks, which meant they knew or suspected that evidence existed. Did they get anything? No, sir. The watchman scared them off before they could take anything. But Sergeant Morrison thought you should know immediately, especially given your inquiries about the Ashworth case. Thank you, Riley. Tell the sergeant I'll report to him first thing in the morning. James waited until the young officer had departed before turning to Cordelia. We need to move quickly. If they're this desperate, they'll soon figure out that the children survived and might know where the evidence is. Cordelia's face was pale but composed. Then we'll need to move the children somewhere even safer. And we'll need to bring this evidence to someone with the authority and integrity to act on it. She paused thoughtfully. Judge Harrison Mitchell. He was a friend of my father's, and he's known for his incorruptibility. If we can present this evidence to him, he can issue warrants and provide protection for Thomas and Margaret. Mitchell is a good choice, James agreed, carefully folding the documents and placing them inside his coat. But we'll need to be cautious about how we approach him. If anyone in this conspiracy learns we're taking this to a judge, they might try to stop us before we can present the evidence. They extinguished all the lamps and left the house, moving quickly through the snow to their waiting carriage. As they drove through the dark streets of Boston, James found himself hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement. Beside him, Cordelia sat with remarkable composure, though he noticed how her hands gripped her reticule tightly. You handled yourself admirably back there, he said quietly. Most women of my acquaintance would have fainted or panicked. She turned to him with a slight smile. Detective Thornton, I may have been raised in privilege, but my father believed in educating his daughter about the realities of the world. He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Besides, her smile widened slightly. I found the experience rather thrilling, if I'm being honest. James couldn't help but return her smile. Miss Winters, you are quite unlike any woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment, Detective. Their eyes met in the dim light of the carriage, and James felt something shift between them. An awareness, a connection forged in shared danger and purpose. He found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before. The delicate curve of her jaw, the intelligence and warmth in her eyes, the way her lips curved when she smiled. This was more than admiration for her courage and character. This was attraction, pure and simple, and it both exhilarated and troubled him. The Winters mansion was quiet when they returned. The only sounds the ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall and the soft footfalls of Mrs. Davies as she came to greet them. The children are sleeping soundly, Miss Cordelia, the housekeeper reported. Little Margaret woke once asking for her mother, but I sat with her until she settled again. Cordelia's expression softened with sympathy. Thank you, Mrs. Davies. Please ensure extra staff are posted at all entrances tonight. No one is to enter without my explicit permission, and Detective Thornton should be notified immediately if anything unusual occurs. Of course, miss. Mrs. Davies departed with a respectful nod, leaving James and Cordelia alone in the grand foyer. Would you care for some tea or coffee before you leave? Cordelia asked. I find myself too restless for sleep, and I suspect you feel the same. James knew he should decline, should maintain proper distance, but the truth was he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not while danger still lurked, and these people, these children, and this remarkable woman might need his protection. Coffee would be welcome, thank you. They settled in the library, a warm, book-lined room with a fire crackling in the marble fireplace. Cordelia poured coffee from a silver service, and they sat in comfortable chairs facing each other. The evidence from the Ashworth house spread on the table between them. We should review everything carefully before we approach Judge Mitchell tomorrow, Cordelia suggested, picking up one of the ledgers. We need to understand exactly what we're presenting and be prepared to answer any questions he might have. For the next hour, they worked together, examining each document, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a comprehensive picture of the fraud and corruption that had cost John Ashworth his life. James found himself increasingly impressed by Cordelia's sharp mind and head for figures. She spotted patterns he'd missed, made connections that illuminated the full scope of the conspiracy. Your father trained you well, he observed, watching her make notations on a piece of paper. You have a natural aptitude for investigation. She looked up with a wry smile. My father believed women were just as capable of rational thought and business acumen as men, a rather progressive view for his time. He taught me to read financial statements before I was 12, took me to his office, explained how his businesses operated. My mother thought it highly inappropriate, but father insisted that I should be prepared to manage my own affairs someday. Her expression grew more serious. I miss him terribly. He died 3 years ago, and there isn't a day that passes when I don't wish I could seek his counsel. He would be proud of you, James said quietly, of the woman you've become, of the good you're doing with the resources he left you. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotion. Cordelia was the first to look away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Tell me about yourself, Detective Thornton. How does a man come to choose a career in law enforcement? James leaned back in his chair, coffee cup cradled in his hands. My father was a police officer, killed in the line of duty when I was 15. My mother was left with 3 children to raise on her own. I saw how the system failed people like us, the poor, the vulnerable, those without power or connections. I joined the force determined to be the kind of officer who actually helped people, who sought justice rather than just maintaining order for the benefit of the wealthy. He paused, realizing he'd revealed more than he typically did. I suppose we both inherited missions from our fathers. And have you found it? Justice, I mean. Cordelia asked softly. Sometimes. More often I find compromise and complexity. But cases like this one, protecting innocent children, exposing corruption, these remind me why I chose this path. He set down his cup and met her gaze directly. Though I must admit, I've never had such capable assistance before. She smiled, and James felt his heart quicken. Nor have I ever been involved in anything so dangerous and, dare I say, exciting. My charitable work is fulfilling, but this, actually making a difference, fighting against real evil, it's rather intoxicating. It's also deadly serious, James reminded her, though he couldn't help returning her smile. These men have already committed murder twice. They won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened. Then we shall have to be very careful, Cordelia replied, her tone firm with resolve. And we shall have to trust each other completely. Detective Thornton, I want you to know that you can depend on me. I won't falter, and I won't reveal anything that might endanger this investigation or those children upstairs. I know, James said, and realized he meant it absolutely. In the short time he'd known her, Cordelia Winters had proven herself to be trustworthy, courageous, and remarkably capable. More than that, she'd awakened something in him he'd thought long buried beneath the weight of his work, the capacity to feel, to hope, to imagine a life that included more than just duty and cases. The clock chimed midnight, breaking the spell. James stood reluctantly. I should go. We both need rest before tomorrow. I'll return at 9 o'clock, and we'll go together to see Judge Mitchell. Cordelia walked him to the door, where his coat waited. As he shrugged it on, she placed a hand on his arm. James, may I call you James? Given the circumstances, such formality seems rather absurd. Please do, he replied, acutely aware of her touch even through the layers of fabric. And I should very much like to call you Cordelia, if you'll permit it. I insist upon it, she said with a warm smile. Until tomorrow then, James. Sleep well and stay safe. The use of his given name, spoken in her cultured voice, sent an unexpected warmth through him. You as well, Cordelia. Keep the doors locked and the staff vigilant. As he walked through the snowy streets toward his modest apartment, James's mind was full of the case, of danger and evidence and strategy. But underneath it all ran a current of something else. Thoughts of hazel eyes and graceful hands, of intelligence and courage wrapped in silk and refinement, of a woman who had somehow, in the space of 2 days, become far more important to him than mere professional collaboration warranted. The following morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. James arrived at the Winters mansion precisely at 9, having spent a restless night reviewing the evidence and planning their approach to Judge Mitchell. He found Cordelia in the breakfast room with Thomas and Margaret, the 3 of them engaged in what appeared to be a drawing lesson. Margaret's face was bright with concentration as she sketched something on paper, while Thomas watched Cordelia demonstrate shading techniques. Good morning, Detective, Thomas said formally, though his eyes held warmth. Cordelia, Miss Winters, has been teaching us to draw. She's very talented. Indeed she is, James agreed, noting the delicate watercolor landscapes adorning the walls. But I'm afraid we must interrupt the lesson. Miss Winters and I have important business this morning. Margaret looked up with wide eyes. Will you catch the bad men today, the ones who hurt our parents? James knelt beside her chair, his expression gentle but honest. We're going to try, Margaret. We're going to talk to a very important judge who can help us make sure those bad men are punished. But these things take time. Mother always said good people win in the end, the little girl said with the absolute faith of childhood. You're good people, I can tell. Cordelia met James's eyes over the children's heads, and he saw his own determination reflected there. They would not fail these children. Whatever it took, they would see justice done. Judge Harrison Mitchell maintained chambers in the courthouse on Pemberton Square, an imposing granite building that spoke of law and authority. James and Cordelia were shown into his private office, a wood-paneled room lined with law books and dominated by a massive desk. The judge himself was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and shrewd blue eyes that missed nothing. Miss Winters, he greeted Cordelia warmly, rising to take her hand. I was grieved to learn of your father's passing. He was a man of great integrity and a dear friend. I trust you are well? As well as can be, Judge Mitchell, thank you. Allow me to introduce Detective James Thornton. We've come on a matter of utmost urgency and sensitivity. For the next hour, they presented their case. The deaths of John and Catherine Ashworth, the evidence of fraud and corruption at Vandermeer Shipping, the danger to the surviving children. James laid out the documents methodically while Cordelia provided context and insight, their presentation seamless and compelling. Judge Mitchell's expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the evidence. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is damning material, and it implicates several very powerful men. Senator Blackwood's brother, Harbor Commissioner Dalton, and at least 3 members of the City Council. If I issue warrants based on this evidence, there will be significant political repercussions. With respect, Your Honor, James said firmly, 2 people are dead, and 2 children are orphaned. Justice must supersede political considerations. Spoken like a man of principle, the judge replied with approval. And you're absolutely right, of course. I'll issue the warrants immediately and request federal marshals to execute them. I don't trust that this corruption hasn't infected the local police force. He turned to Cordelia. Miss Winters, I understand the children are in your care. That's both admirable and dangerous. I can arrange for federal protection if you'd prefer. The children are comfortable and feel safe with me, Cordelia said. I have adequate staff and security, and Detective Thornton has been most vigilant. Unless you believe they're in immediate danger, I'd prefer not to uproot them again so soon. Very well. But I'm assigning 2 federal marshals to watch your house, and Detective Thornton, I expect you to maintain close oversight. The judge's expression softened slightly. Your father would be proud of you, Cordelia. Taking in these children, putting yourself at risk for justice. That's the Winters spirit he instilled in you. As they left the courthouse, James felt cautiously optimistic. The wheels of justice were turning, warrants would be issued, and arrests would follow. But he also knew that cornered animals were most dangerous, and the men they were moving against had much to lose. The arrests began that very afternoon. Federal marshals, armed with Judge Mitchell's warrants, moved swiftly through Boston's business district and harbor, taking men into custody before word could spread and evidence could be destroyed. James accompanied them to the Vandermeer Shipping Company headquarters, a 4-story brick building overlooking the harbor where ships bobbed at anchor in the gray December waters. Charles Vandermeer himself, a portly man in his 50s with mutton-chop whiskers and an air of entitled arrogance, was apprehended in his lavish office. His protests of innocence and threats of legal action fell on deaf ears as the marshals led him away in handcuffs. Similar scenes played out across the city. Harbor Commissioner Dalton arrested at his home, Senator Blackwood's brother taken from his club, and 3 city councilmen detained at City Hall. By evening, the story had broken in the newspapers. The Boston Globe ran a special edition with the headline, Massive Fraud Uncovered at Vandermeer Shipping, Prominent Citizens Arrested in Customs Scandal. The article, while lacking some details to protect the ongoing investigation, made clear that 2 murders had been committed to conceal the conspiracy, and that the evidence had come to light only through the courageous actions of an unnamed detective and a prominent Boston philanthropist. James returned to the Winters mansion as dusk fell, finding Cordelia in the library with the children. Margaret was curled up beside her on the sofa, listening raptly as Cordelia read from a storybook, while Thomas sat nearby working on a jigsaw puzzle. It was a scene of such domestic tranquility that James paused in the doorway, reluctant to disturb it. Cordelia looked up and saw him, her face brightening. "James, we've been following the news. Mrs. Davies brought us the evening papers. Is it over? Have they been caught?" "The main conspirators are in custody," James confirmed, stepping into the room. "Judge Mitchell has assigned prosecutors to the case, and with the evidence we provided, convictions are all but certain. Thomas, Margaret, the men responsible for what happened to your parents will face justice." Thomas looked up from his puzzle, his young face serious. "Will we have to testify? To tell people what we know?" "Probably not," James said gently, kneeling beside the boy. "The documentary evidence is strong enough without requiring you to relive painful memories in court. Judge Mitchell wants to protect you from that if possible." "What will happen to us now?" Margaret asked, her small voice uncertain. "We don't have any family left. Our grandparents are all gone, and father was an only child. Mother had a sister, but she lives in California, and we've never even met her." Cordelia's hand gently stroked the child's golden curls. "You'll stay here with me for as long as you need to. We'll contact your aunt in California and see what she wishes to do. But until then, you have a home here. You're safe, and you're cared for." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You're very kind. Mother would have liked you. She always said there were good people in the world who helped others." James watched Cordelia embrace the little girl and felt his heart constrict with emotion. Over the past 3 days, he'd witnessed a side of life he'd rarely encountered in his work. Not just corruption and violence, but also genuine goodness, selfless courage, and compassion. And at the center of it all was this remarkable woman who'd opened her home and heart to 2 orphan children without a moment's hesitation. Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, James and Cordelia sat together in the library once more. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the tension that had marked the past few days had finally eased. They were safe. The children were safe. Justice would be served. "I received a letter this afternoon," Cordelia said quietly, holding a cream-colored envelope. "From Mrs. Alice Ashworth in San Francisco, Catherine's sister." She'd been trying to reach Catherine for weeks with no response. When she saw the news of the deaths in the papers, she immediately telegraphed Judge Mitchell, who provided her with my address. She paused, her expression thoughtful. "She wants the children, James. She and her husband have no children of their own, and she says Thomas and Margaret are her only remaining family. She's arranging passage on a train and should arrive within the week." James felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that the children would have family to care for them, but also a sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. In just a few days, Thomas and Margaret had somehow worked their way into his heart, and saying goodbye to them would mean saying goodbye to his reason for seeing Cordelia every day. "That's wonderful news for the children," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Family is important." "Yes," Cordelia agreed, though he heard the same note of sadness in her voice. "Though I confess I'll miss them terribly. This house has felt more alive these past days than it has in years. It's been nice having children here again, hearing laughter and questions, and the patter of little feet." "You've been wonderful with them," James said sincerely. "You have a natural gift for nurturing, for making people feel safe and valued. Those children are lucky to have had you in their lives, even briefly." Cordelia turned to face him fully, and in the firelight, her beauty took his breath away. "And what about you, James Thornton? What happens now that the case is solved? Do you simply move on to the next investigation? Or do you ever allow yourself to reflect on what you've accomplished, on the lives you've saved?" "Typically, I do move on," he admitted. "That's the nature of the work. There's always another case, another person in need. But this one," he hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. "This one has been different. Working with you, seeing your courage and compassion, protecting those children together. It's reminded me that there's more to life than just duty and justice. It's reminded me of what I've been missing." "And what is that?" Cordelia asked softly, leaning slightly closer. "Connection, partnership, the company of someone who understands the work but also sees beyond it. Someone who—" He paused, his heart racing. This was dangerous territory, crossing the professional boundaries he'd maintained so carefully. But the truth was undeniable. Somewhere in the chaos of this case, amid danger and investigation and protecting innocent children, he'd fallen for Cordelia Winters. Deeply, irrevocably, and completely. Someone who makes you feel alive. Cordelia finished for him, her hazel eyes searching his face. Someone who challenges you and stands beside you and makes you believe that perhaps duty and happiness need not be mutually exclusive? Yes, James breathed, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Cordelia, I know this is sudden and perhaps inappropriate given the circumstances, but I must tell you, these past days with you have been the most remarkable of my life. Your intelligence, your courage, your kindness, everything about you has captivated me. I find myself thinking of you constantly, and the thought of returning to my life as it was, without you in it, is unbearable. Cordelia's face lit with a smile that transformed her features, making her more beautiful than he'd thought possible. Oh, James, I've been feeling exactly the same way. I kept telling myself it was merely the excitement of the investigation, the danger bringing us together, but it's so much more than that. You're everything I never knew I was looking for. Principled, brave, genuinely good in a way that's rare in any social class. When I'm with you, I feel more myself than I ever have before. James reached for her hand, propriety forgotten in the rush of emotion. I have nothing to offer you that compares to what you already possess. I'm a detective with a modest income and a dangerous profession. My apartment has 4 rooms, all of them smaller than this library. I can't give you the life of luxury you're accustomed to. I don't want luxury, Cordelia said firmly, her fingers tightening around his. I want authenticity. I want purpose. I want a partnership with someone who values me for my mind and character, not my fortune. James, I've had countless suitors over the years, men who saw only my inheritance or my social connections. You're the first man who's ever treated me as an equal, who's trusted me with real responsibility and danger, who's seen me as a partner rather than a prize to be won. You are my equal, James said, pulling her gently closer. In every way that matters, you surpass me. Your courage these past days has been extraordinary. You could have simply provided shelter for the children and remained safely distant from the investigation, but instead, you stood beside me every step of the way. You risked your safety, your reputation, everything, for justice and for 2 children you'd never met. We risked it together, Cordelia corrected softly, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, especially if it meant more time with you. They sat close together now, hands clasped, faces mere inches apart. James could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath, could smell the subtle lavender scent that clung to her skin. Every instinct told him to close that final distance, to kiss her as he'd been longing to do since the moment in the carriage when she'd called him James for the first time. But he also wanted to do this properly, to honor her as she deserved. Cordelia Winters, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know this is sudden, and I know I should court you properly with flowers and formal calls and all the social niceties your position demands, but I'm not a man accustomed to pretense or games. I'm asking you directly, may I court you? May I call on you not as a detective on a case, but as a man who hopes, with time, to win your heart? James, she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, you've already won my heart. From the moment you wrapped your coat around that freezing child and carried him to safety, from the moment you trusted me enough to involve me in your investigation, from every moment since, you've shown me who you truly are, and I love what I've seen. Yes, you may court me. In fact, I insist upon it. Unable to restrain himself any longer, James raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, properly, but with such tender intensity that Cordelia caught her breath. I promise you, he said, I will spend every day proving myself worthy of your affection. I'll protect you, honor you, and stand beside you in whatever causes you pursue. And perhaps someday, if you'll have me, I'll ask you to be my wife. I rather think I'd like that, Cordelia whispered, a beautiful blush coloring her cheeks. In fact, I'm quite certain of it. They sat together by the fire far into the night, talking about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, their dreams, their hopes for the future. James learned about Cordelia's desire to expand her charitable work, perhaps to establish a scholarship fund for children like Thomas and Margaret, who'd lost parents. Cordelia learned about James's dream of someday reforming the police force from within, making it truly serve all citizens equally regardless of wealth or status. The week that followed was perhaps the happiest of James's life. By day, he worked to finalize the case against the Vandermeer conspirators, testifying before the grand jury, and ensuring every detail was documented properly. By evening, he called at the Winters mansion, where he and Cordelia spent hours in each other's company, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone, always deepening their connection and their understanding of one another. Thomas and Margaret flourished under Cordelia's care, their grief slowly giving way to cautious hope for the future. James taught Thomas basic detective skills, observation, deduction, logical thinking, while Cordelia helped Margaret with her reading and drawing. They became, for that brief week, almost like a family, and James found himself imagining a future where such domestic happiness might be permanent. When Alice Ashworth arrived from California, she proved to be a kind-hearted woman in her 30s, with her sister's gentle demeanor and genuine warmth. She wept as she embraced her niece and nephew, thanking James and Cordelia profusely for protecting them and caring for them. "Catherine wrote to me often about you both," she said, surprising them. In her last letter, received just days before she died, she mentioned a detective she'd heard about, a man of integrity who helped people without regard for their social standing. And she spoke of you, Miss Winters, and your work with orphaned children. It's as if she knew somehow who would save her babies when she no longer could. The day came for Thomas and Margaret to depart for their new life in California. The farewell at the train station was bittersweet, full of hugs and promises to write. Margaret clung to Cordelia, making her promise to visit soon, while Thomas shook James's hand with all the solemnity of a gentleman, then impulsively hugged him fiercely. "Thank you for keeping us safe," the boy whispered, "just like Mom said you would." As the train pulled away, carrying the children toward their new beginning, James stood with his arm around Cordelia's shoulders, a liberty she'd granted him just that morning, and felt her tears soak into his coat. "They'll be happy," he assured her gently. "Mrs. Ashworth loves them, and San Francisco offers a fresh start, away from the painful memories here." "I know," Cordelia said, wiping her eyes, "but I'll miss them terribly." "As will I," James admitted, "but perhaps—" He paused, gathering his courage for what he was about to suggest. "Perhaps this is an opportunity for us to think about our own future. Cordelia, these past weeks with you have shown me what my life could be, what it should be. I don't want to return to the loneliness of my bachelor existence, investigating cases alone, returning each night to empty rooms. I want a partner, a companion, a wife who shares my passion for justice and my desire to make the world better." Cordelia turned in his arms, her face radiant despite her tears. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me," James said, his voice steady and sure despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "I know it's soon, and I know I can't offer you wealth or grand estates, but I can offer you my whole heart, my unwavering devotion, and a life filled with purpose and meaning. Together, we could do so much good. Your resources and connections combined with my knowledge of the city's darker corners. We could truly make a difference." "Yes," Cordelia said without hesitation, her smile bright as sunlight. "Yes, James Thornton, I'll marry you. I'll gladly trade grand estates for genuine partnership, luxury for love, and empty social obligations for a life of real meaning by your side." He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, there on the platform as the last wisps of steam from the departed train dissipated into the cold December air. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, that marked a beginning, that transformed two separate lives into one shared journey. 6 months later, on a bright June morning in 1899, James Thornton and Cordelia Winters were married in a small ceremony at Trinity Church, attended by close friends, Judge Mitchell, Mrs. Davies and the household staff, and several of the children from Cordelia's orphanage. The bride wore cream silk and carried white roses. The groom wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling. They honeymooned briefly in Newport before returning to Boston, where they settled into a comfortable home on Chestnut Street, large enough for Cordelia's charitable work and James's need for a home office, small enough to maintain with a modest staff. Cordelia continued her philanthropic endeavors with renewed vigor, establishing the Ashworth Foundation in memory of Thomas and Margaret's parents, providing assistance to families affected by crime. James was promoted to detective sergeant and began implementing reforms within the police department, always with Cordelia's counsel and support. Letters arrived regularly from California, full of news of Thomas and Margaret's progress, Thomas's excellence in school, Margaret's artistic talents, their happiness with their aunt and uncle. Each letter brought joy and gratitude, reminders of the case that had brought James and Cordelia together. On cold winter evenings, they would sit together in their library, smaller than the one at the Winters mansion but infinitely cozier, and remember that snowy December when a frightened boy hiding behind a bench had asked a question that changed everything. "Will you keep us safe?" James had kept them safe. More than that, he'd found his own salvation in the process, discovering that the greatest mystery he'd ever solved was how to open his guarded heart to love. And Cordelia had found the partnership and purpose she'd always craved, proving that true nobility came not from birth or wealth, but from courage, compassion, and the willingness to fight for what was right. Together, they built a life of meaning and joy, never forgetting the children who'd brought them together, always working to ensure that other innocent souls would find protection and justice in a world that often seemed too dark and dangerous. Their love, forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose, grew stronger with each passing year, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as cases to solve, mysteries to unravel, and children who need heroes. And they lived happily, purposefully, and passionately ever after, their partnership serving as a beacon of hope in Boston's sometimes shadowy streets, proving that love and justice, properly combined, could indeed change the world.